Thank you. The final item of business is a member's business debate on motion 22614 in the name of Stuart McMillan on Museum for Human Rights. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Stuart McMillan to open the debate. Mr McMillan, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. First of all, I'd like to thank all of those who signed the motion to allow this debate to take place, and also those who stayed back to take part in the debate. Now, certainly what I'm going to say today is really only going to scratch the surface of Inverclyde's history in the transatlantic slave trade, but also why the museum should be located in my constituency. And I would like to also thank at this point everyone who has offered to support and provided feedback for the idea. Now, I want to clarify one point at the outset, though, and that's that I do realise that there was the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which prohibited the slave trade in the British Empire. However, it didn't abolish slavery. Slavery continued until the Slavery Abolition Act in 1833, hence the reason I used that date in the motion. Also, according to Black History Month 2020, Scots owned nearly 30% of the estates in Jamaica in 1796 and 32% of the plantations by 1817. I'm going to touch upon just a few themes. First of all, the Parliament's decision in June, Inverclyde's history, the initial proposal as per my motion, and also the actions to date. And certainly, just on that particular point, I will touch upon the fact that Canada possesses the National Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg, which Claire Adamson has spoken about in this chamber before, and I'm sure she'll probably touch upon it again today. But I genuinely believe that that could be very much a positive model for us to look at. Presiding Officer, I wasn't one of the speakers during the showing solidarity with the anti-racism debate in June, but I sat in the chamber and listened to everyone in what was very much a powerful afternoon. I was pleased that the Parliament voted to address our shameful past, a past that we can never change. Some would like to erase our past or keep it confined to the shelves, but we must own up to it and educate future generations and also ourselves about it. We must learn the lessons of the past and find a way that tells the history of the transatlantic slave trade and tells the history of how some of Scotland's wealth was created. It's also worth noting that across the world this debate is taking place, and today's announcement in Barbados should also be noted. I'm not a historian, but a politician, and I can never tell the history like historians, but I can bring to the table politically reasons why my constituency should be the location for such a museum. There are various locations in Scotland that have played a part in the transatlantic slave trade, as well as Greenock, Port Glasgow, and also Glasgow. There was Ayr, Dumfries, Bo'ness, Leith, Dundee and Aberdeen. Greenock and Port Glasgow were the two ports that serviced Glasgow, and with an increasing number of merchants in Glasgow, then the two ports became key in the transatlantic slave trade. I grew up in Port Glasgow, and I remember the town and the stories of it actually being called the Port of Glasgow. Inverclyde's maritime history has many aspects, and many ships have been built over the years. However, our maritime links also include the sugar, tobacco and cotton industries, which also are very much linked to the transatlantic slave trade. Port Glasgow itself was the main port for voyages to Western Africa until the 1750s. Greenock then became the larger of the ports, and this continued in Greenock until 1766. And Greenock became the main port for the trade in tobacco and sugar. It's been reported that in time Greenock became the worldwide port for the sugar trade. But some reports, however, indicate that it was actually just one of the biggest. It's a fact, however, that ships with enslaved people left both Greenock and Port Glasgow. It's known that 2,692 enslaved people were in vessels that left the two ports to cross the Atlantic to work in plantations. And 471 of these people died during these voyages. Presiding Officer, I realise that the number of voyages, the number of people transported, and the number of people who died on these voyages might not compare with other parts of the UK, and certainly other parts of the UK that, and I use this word advisedly, benefited from the slave trade and also the associated industries, such as Liverpool and Bristol. But that doesn't mean that this part of Scotland's history should be quietly reflected upon. Each of these people were human beings. Scotland's history in the transatlantic slave trade clearly It's far greater than just Greenock and Port Glasgow, and it's absolutely right that a museum is created. The fact that Scotland is now prepared to fully face up to and own its past is very much a welcome step. Now, I suggested a museum of human rights to be based at the sugar warehouses at the James Oak Dock in Greenock for a variety of reasons. Firstly, the history of the building being part of the sugar industry, which was built on the back of slavery, highlights that the wealth generated through the slave trade and associated industries is still visible today. Secondly, the building is vast, and the opportunity to deliver something of stature educationally is such a strong offer. The building itself could be divided into multiple facilities, including the excellent and innovative proposition from the Clyde Atlantic Trust to create a fully immersive maritime museum, but certainly there would also be space for other activities as well. Thirdly, I believe there will be other parts of Scotland's negative history that could and should be told. For example, the story of the Highland clearances and the 1820 martyrs could be incorporated, both of which have strong local connections. Also the story of why 600,000 Scots left Greenock to go to the New Worlds in addition to those that left Leith. There's also the history of the Irish immigrants to Scotland and how they were treated. Now, these are ideas to get people to imagine what we can achieve, to educate future and current generations. Any museum must have the focus about the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism, as per the agreed amended motion in this chamber in June. However, that doesn't mean that this museum can't touch upon other aspects of Scotland's past. Now, fourthly, the site is located at the historic James Watt Dock in Greenock. Watt himself was not involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but he did profit from it. And fifthly, the educational, the social and the economic opportunities for Inverclyde and Scotland are such that a project of this size can have a transformational effect for my constituency. I studied in Dundee in the 1990s, and to see the change that's happening in that city now is just, it's wonderful. And I'm very proud of the city to actually have this level of ambition. And by placing the museum in Inverclyde, a transformational change could happen involving inward investment, reversing population decline, and becoming a stronger social and economic area. And the Scottish Government's programme for government itself talks about work to start to examine ways to address migration and areas with population decline. And I questioned the Minister, Ben McPherson, this last week at the Culture Committee when he was in front of us, and the museum in Inverclyde could be part of that solution. So far, I've undertaken a number of things. I've spoken to Sir Geoff Palmer and David Hayman. I've undertaken a variety of press activity, which has certainly helped garner some further support. I've also established a short life working group, which includes Ronnie Cowan MP, the Principal of West College Scotland, Scottish Enterprise, the Inverclyde Chamber of Commerce, Creative Inverclyde, the Clyde Atlantic Trust, singer-songwriter Matthew Hickman, and also we're supported by TV presenter Jean Johansson. I also invited the leader of Inverclyde Council to join, and we're hopeful that he can do so once the internal council procedures are fulfilled. I've also spoken with Lucy Cassett of Museums Galleries Scotland, who are taking forward this project for the Scottish Government. Lucy will also be speaking to the Working Party on Monday morning. And the Heritage Lottery Fund have also been engaged with, and they've also agreed to come to speak to the group, virtually of course. Now, we've met 3 times thus far and have an agreed purpose to bring this facility to Inverclyde. Sugar warehouses are what we're discussing today. However, some of the debates we've had and started to consider, Greenock has a number of locations, such as the Glebe, which actually was a sugar refinery, and also the tobacco warehouse, both of which still exist in the town. Also, they're very much just a stone's throw away from each other. Now, Presiding Officer, I'm conscious of time, and I was born in Balwyn-Furness, but I grew up in Port Glasgow. It's still my hometown, even though I no longer live in the town. As a boy, I never knew why, and I never questioned why we had the Kingston Yard in the town. I never questioned why there was a Jamaica Street, a Tobago Street, a Togo Place, and a Virginia Street in Greenock. And I had no idea about the Gourock crest of arms, which has links to the Darragh family, who made their fortune as sugar merchants in Jamaica in the 1700s. This story became quite a revelation to many people locally during the summer. A museum of Human Rights focusing on the transatlantic slave trade in Inverclyde wouldn't be out of place. Sadly, we have many links to the transatlantic slave trade, and I've only, as I say, just touched upon them. But I would like to educate younger generations about the past to certainly improve the future. Presiding Officer, we can use this museum as a foundation stone on which to build a regeneration project that will breathe new life into an area that so needs that helping hand, an area which has suffered many social ills over many decades and is again reeling from the effects of this COVID-19. I believe a new beacon of hope emerging from the clouds of Scotland's past would be a fitting way to honour those lives that were lost and taken by our inglorious colonial history. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms Macmillan. Open debate, Claire Adamson, to be followed by Jeremy Balfour. Ms Adamson, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I thank Stuart McMillan for securing this debate and admire his tenacity for his constituency and the case that he has made for a physical human rights museum in Scotland being based in his constituency, and I think he's made a very good case of that this evening. He is very right to say that I visited the Canadian Museum of Human Rights on a visit from this Parliament in 2017, and it was an absolutely profound experience for me. I had never come across such a museum, and the manner in which the Canadians had approached it was just incredible. They established it with the Museums Act in 2008, and it's seen as a national and international destination centre of learning, where people from all around the world can engage in discussion and commit to taking action against hate and oppression. And I think Mr McMillan laid the foundations for that, of what a museum in Scotland could be about as well. I was very intrigued by some of the displays that I saw there. I think in terms of educating younger children, they had an interactive floor where when you walked onto it, you appeared like a single coloured circle underneath your feet. And in order to get the pattern and the floor moving and excited by what was happening, you had to engage with the other people on the floor. Sort of a very simple metaphor for young people to say that, you know, beauty and life is enriched by interaction rather than just being singly on your own. They also had a jury exhibit where it had real-life cases of human rights that had gone through the Canadian courts. And we know Canada has had its issues with these issues that we've been talking about. Indeed, they've also had to deal with the issue of their First Nation people who were treated so badly in the past, and their reparation in that area. And I think that the two things I took from this was the education, but the bearing witness, honestly, of the past and what colonialism had meant for Canada as a country. And I think this education part of this is so key. I was delighted to work with North Lanarkshire councillors Danish Ashraf and Aggie McGowan earlier this year when they presented, which I believe is the first motion to be passed in a council in Scotland, asking that education should include a look at the colonial history of our country, honestly. And that was after the Black Lives Matter movement had taken hold. And I was delighted North Lanarkshire passed that motion. And also, I pay tribute to young constituents of my own, Alicia and Lauren Omike, who themselves have mixed race backgrounds, spoke out at that time about what it was like for them growing up in Scotland and the lack of knowledge about why they were there and what the history of their family had been, and how they integrated into our country. And I think it's so important that we pay tribute to the people who are asking for this engagement. So when the programme for government was announced earlier, I was delighted to see the commitment there for education. So my ask of the Minister this evening, I'm not asking for your museum in my constituency, although some others might in the room this evening, but I would ask if we could have an indication of how people like the young Omike twins or the council group in North Lanarkshire can engage with the government to ensure that this idea of education around Black Lives Matter, about colonial history, is taken forward and that they can have their voices heard during the development of those education programmes. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I call Jeremy Balfour to be followed by Neil Bibby. Mr Balfour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I thank Stuart McMillan for bringing this important debate to the Parliament tonight. His motion refers to a previous debate held in this chamber back in June, when I was pleased to report that there was a cross-party support to create a museum for slavery here in Scotland, and now we're looking at where it should go. Over the summer, we witnessed the appalling death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. The terrible action of violence carried out by a police officer has led to a widespread anti-racism protest throughout the USA and sent shockwaves across the world, including here in Scotland. As protests in Edinburgh, Glasgow encourage us all to hold debate and discussion about how we build a more equal future here in Scotland, we must not forget Scots' participation in slavery. In his motion, Stuart McMillan refers to Inverclyde's past, and we've heard more of that tonight. How the area prospered because of the slave trade, by importing slave products such as sugar. The great tobacco trade of the 18th century in Glasgow could not have existed without slave labour. Working on the plantations was a forced choice for Scots seeking their fortunes in the late 18th and early 19th century. Historians have argued that Scotland's relationship with transatlantic slavery is encarned in a collective amnesia, a widespread lack of awareness of how our country participated in both the slave trade and slavery. In June, a group of protesters toppled the statue of a former slave trader, Sir Edward Colston. Following his action, there were calls from across Scotland to remove statues and street names that honour individuals who were involved in the slave trade. I have concerns about using the common moral standards of today as benchmarks by which to judge past behaviour. Is it right that Edinburgh University has taken the decision to temporarily rename the David Hume Tower because of 18th century philosophers' comments on race? I believe it's not possible to make a moral balance sheet of the past. I'm not suggesting that historical figures should not escape our moral judgment, but we have to accept our past contains uncomfortable truths. Rather than hide our past from future generations, surely it is better to change attitudes through education and through museums, as we're talking about tonight. I agree with Sir Geoff Palmer, Scotland's first black professor, who states, if you remove the evidence, you remove the deed. However, I believe there's an opportunity to create a museum with responsibility to reflect and debate history accurately, and doing so to confront, challenge and learn from the uncomfortable truths of Scotland's history and our past. In the debate in June, as we've heard already from Claire Adamson herself, she spoke about her profound experience of visiting the Canadian Museum of Human Rights. Canada's National Museum is a unique exploration of the importance of human rights. As we've heard again today, located in a stunning building, the mandate to explore the subject of human rights with special but not exclusive reference to Canada in order to enhance the public's understanding of human rights, to promote respect for others and to encourage reflection and dialogue. I feel this model could be used to articulate and examine Scotland's role, not only in the slave trade, but to explore a diversity of human rights, be in relation to the Holocaust, the suffragette movement, employees' rights and the plight of what's happening in China at the moment. Whether a future museum is located in the Clyde with historical links to the slave trade may well be the right place to put it, and I think we've heard a very compelling argument today from a member. What is important that it's a lived experience of individuals, that we preserve and promote Scottish heritage, we overcome ignorance and we aspire learning to do better today and in the future. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Balfe. I call Neil Bibby, to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin by welcoming this motion in the debate brought forward by Stuart McMillan. We must recognise, as Jeremy Balfour did, that the Black Lives Matter movement and the death of George Floyd has been instrumental in a renewed focus and debate here in Scotland and across the UK on our country's past links with colonialism and the slave trade. It's important that these issues and how we respond to it are under active consideration and discussion, not just in Parliament, but across the wider country too. Whilst we cannot erase the past, we can do more to ensure we remember it honestly A national museum on human rights, therefore, is one way to achieve this. I do support the idea of a national museum and the concept of establishing it in Inverclyde. Earlier this year, Inverclyde Council set up a working group in response to the new public discussion on our past. In a report by the Council, they reflect honestly on how Inverclyde was, as Stuart McMillan and others have referenced, a hub for the slave trade. As Stuart McMillan has said, Inverclyde was particularly active in sugar, tobacco trading, and regrettably, Greenock's first MP, Robert Wallace, owned and co-mortgaged 5 plantations in Jamaica and owned a total of over 500 slaves. Therefore, Inverclyde would be an appropriate place for the museum, and I support the aspirations and hopes of this motion. Though I believe that a national museum must commit itself to be a wide-ranging recollection of our entire country's role, and I think Stuart McMillan raised some important points and issues about how other issues affecting people's history could be incorporated. I think there are a couple of obvious questions for the Scottish Government on this. The Government has said it's supportive, and it would be helpful to know, is the Government committed to one single physical space, or are they exploring options of virtual, perhaps even pop-up exhibitions across the country to explore different regional contributions to the slave trade? Secondly, in response to the COVID crisis, we can all respect that as one of the worst hit areas, Inverclyde would benefit somewhat from the creation of the museum, but it would be unfair for one council, which is already suffering due to cuts, to bear the cost of a national museum. It would be also therefore helpful to know whether the Government is fully prepared to fund the capital and revenue costs of a national museum. Whilst considering this proposal, we also need the Government to commit to using education in our schools as another way of recognising our past links with colonialism. Like other members I've raised with the Education Secretary, the views that Scottish pupils should be taught about our historic abhorrent links with slavery. This followed representations from young people and teachers contacting me upset that their education had left this piece of Scottish history untouched. And I welcome the confirmation that a reference guide on key resources regarding Black history and minority ethnical heritage has been made available. But the Government must go further. We must ensure that there are direct, accurate and detailed resources about Scotland's past. As I've mentioned, as Stuart McMillan made reference to in his speech, Inverclyde and Scottish history is intrinsically linked with colonialism and slave trading, so there is scope to build upon the curriculum we have and go further in teaching a more honest representation of Scotland's past and past Scots. This discussion on Scotland's past will not go away, and nor should it. Now is an opportune time to redouble our efforts in the campaign for equality. Though we are today discussing the injustices of the past, it's clear that there are injustices today that we must take action against too. Coronavirus has disproportionately hit Black and minority ethnic communities worse, and Black minority ethnic people continue to be chronically underrepresented in Scottish public life. And then, of course, in discussing slavery, we must take action against modern-day slavery. The Cooperative Party suggests that there are 13,000 victims of modern slavery in the UK, so I again renew my support for their campaign. Slavery was and remains one of the great evils in society. Even today, tens of thousands of people across the UK are believed to be victims of forced labour, sexual exploitation and modern forms of slavery. Understanding the past helps us understand the injustices of today. Our role now is to remember past injustices whilst fighting against those that continue to prevail in Scottish society today. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you very much. And I call Stuart Stevenson, who will be followed by Jamie Green, please. Mr. Stevenson, are you muted?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I manually switched my microphone on. I had expected to come on from your end. So thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Stuart McMillan for the opportunity to discuss this important subject. Just in passing, you did make reference to the 1820 martyrs. Gil Patterson, our colleague, had a members' debate on that on the 5th of September 2001, which happened to be the third debate in which I participated when I joined this Parliament. And of course, that was important to me because John Baird was my great uncle. However, to the matter in hand, I think there are many places across Scotland that we could consider for a museum, but the sugar warehouse in James Watt Dock in Greenock is perhaps one of the most significant symbols of Scotland's relationship with slavery, and as such, it would be perfect to juxtapose brutal human costs of slavery next to a symbol of Scotland's economic wealth. I believe it's hard for a modern person to recognise our connection to that time. But as my grandfather was an infant when Abraham Lincoln managed to abolish slavery in the United States, the temporal distance may be shorter than some of us might care to imagine. The human psyche has a habit of distancing itself from unpleasant things, how much more so when the subject is slavery, something as violent and abhorrent as that. But the brutal legacy, and indeed of much of colonialism, belongs to us as much as anything else does as well. The museum on this topic could be in many places, perhaps in the northeast that I represent, as elsewhere. We only need to consider the Powers Gates in Aberdeen, built by Hugh Fraser Leslie in 1834. The gate itself features carvings of slaves on it, making direct reference to the several coffee plantations that he owned in Jamaica. But it doesn't end there. There are former students from Marshall College who became involved in the slave trade. There were those who inherited wealth from it. There were even those who were involved in the abduction of slaves from Africa itself. You see, no matter where you're from in this nation, there will be at least some connection to this dark part of our history. The museum gives us the opportunity to take some responsibility, but it's far from being the final and only step in doing so. It's a first and very useful step. It can represent a new chapter in our maturation as a nation and our own maturation as human beings. Responsibility we have to uphold the human rights of all people in the present and recognise our failings in the past. We shouldn't pretend the unpleasant past never happened by simply trying to erase it. I think in that sense I've heard some interesting comments, and I share the belief that we shouldn't tear down statues, but we should ensure that we rewrite the context in which they exist, because they remind us of a dark past that we shouldn't seek to erase. The museum could represent a signal that we've come to recognise the iniquities of our predecessors. Our society should today reward honesty, growth and knowledge, but its benefits as a museum will go much further than that, forcing us to look at the truth of our own past brutality. We, if we are anything as human beings, carry compassion. I hope that whenever this museum is established, we share responsibility for our history through it. I hope that inspires us to be the best that we can be, that we will be compassionate, and that this establishment would be a light to guide us out of darkness and of ignorance. I end by congratulating Stuart McMillan on his championship of local interests. That's exactly the exemplar we should look to all our members and to the interests of his constituency. I'm happy to support his efforts. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I now call Jamie Green, please.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking the member for Greenock and Clyde for bringing forward this debate, and I'm delighted to speak in it for two reasons. The first, of course, is that I would not miss the opportunity to talk about my hometown in a national debate in our Parliament, given its historic connections with the subject we debate. But more importantly, I also participated in the previous debate that we had on this subject. And my interest in this is about education, because ultimately for me this is not really a debate about whether or not we should have a museum of this nature or even where it should be, but what is its purpose and what is its benefit. Because for me education lies at the heart of understanding our heritage, our history and our culture, and if taught properly it can enlighten us in a way that we often criticise with the judgments of today, those who thought themselves enlightened in that period. Now, I am phenomenally proud of Greenock. I'm proud of having been born and brought up there. I'm proud of its rich history, and I'm proud to be able to represent Greenock as part of my West Scotland region. And it really has punched above its weight in the world. We've produced the likes of the great engineer James Watt, the great comedian Chick Murray, the great novelist Lynn Anderson, whose genre of tartan noir could easily describe the subject matter we talk of today. And historically, we were at the heart of the UK's trade with the rest of the world. And I think we should be overwhelmingly proud of what we have achieved and the town's contribution to the world across all of these fields. But it is undoubtable that there are aspects of our history, as others have pointed out, which are darker and which should be explored and learned from. And that, of course, does include our role in the triangular trade between continents, when unfortunately it was a lot more than just coffee and tobacco on these ships. It was people. And that is undeniable, and it's difficult, but it's not something to shy away from. And just as we marvel at the glory of the buildings and the arts and the statues and the institutions, and often the philanthropic efforts and infrastructure that these enlightened people built, we cannot be in denial about the source of their wealth in many cases. But I will say this, I was not there. I was brought up with the phrase, "Who am I to judge another when I walk imperfectly?" Because I think that anachronistic judgment of the deeds of history serves us no favour. I do believe that there is a credible compromise in acknowledging that people did things then that we no longer deem appropriate or legal or moral, whilst respecting that not all of those deeds were cruel or corrupt. And for me, James Watt epitomises that in some ways, the great son of Greenock. Such a great mind and a great thinker, yet by many tainted now by his own source of wealth. I studied at James Watt College in Greenock with a great sense of pride. The connotations of his inventive mind were things to be proud of. But let's look at how other countries have dealt with their checkered past. We talked about Canada. Well, there's also the Canadian Museum of History, which sits in Quebec. Its mission is to give pride to the place of the First Peoples. My own Canadian family taught me to participate and respect the culture of Canada's Indigenous population and its history in Ontario, where much of my family still live. And I've been to the Australian Museum in Sydney when I lived down under, which explores in great detail the history of the Aboriginal population who lived there long before we did. Or in New Zealand, which has taken a different route and embraced its past with such pride. This week is Maori Language Week, for example, and it's something to be celebrated by all parts of Kiwi culture. The International Slavery Museum in Liverpool doesn't sit too far away in the Royal Albert Dock in that city. And it's a great example of how a museum is not just bricks and mortar, but a living being of studying and learning, and something for the community to be proud of, not simply a building of judgment. We can do the same here on our shores, surely. A new National Museum on our heritage, in my view, should be based in Greenock. And the James Watt Dock Sugar Sheds does provide an ideal location. But if not there, then elsewhere. And if nothing else, the symbolism of that alone should serve as Greenock's second beacon. One of light, one of acknowledgement, and indeed one of hope.
Thank you very much. I now call on Christina McKelvey to close for the Government. Minister, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I congratulate Stuart McMillan for bringing this incredibly interesting and informative debate to the Chamber today and securing the support across the Chamber for his debate. I've really enjoyed all of the contributions and they've given me much thoughts to think on. The motion, Presiding Officer, acknowledges the presence of various locations across Scotland which have links to slavery and which would be considered in the planning for a new national museum, the proposal of which was agreed for in this Parliament. So whilst not giving commitments to Mr McMillan or Mr Green on a permanent site in Inverclyde, can I congratulate Mr McMillan on his considerable efforts for Inverclyde and Greenock, for which I know he is a true champion. And notwithstanding that, I know Stuart Stevenson's just made a bid for the north east of Scotland as well, and can I reassure Neil Bibby that we're looking at all of the options, including some of the more virtual options in the work with the Huntarian as well. So there's many ways I think that we can do this, but we do have a rich but complex history, and there are challenges in accepting the unacceptable truths of our past, much as we have spoken about today. The trading of humans as slaves, as chattel, as property, is absolutely unthinkable to us now, notwithstanding the challenges we do have with modern slavery. But it's deeply incompatible with notions of dignity, respect or autonomy of the individual, or indeed their human rights. We have tended in Scotland to think of ourselves distant to the transatlantic slave trade. We, convinced ourselves with some romantic notion that we are remote from the abuses of empire and exploitation. You just need to take a walk down Virginia Street for that notion to be smashed from your head. Yet, as this debate has highlighted, a significant part of the wealth which flowed into the 18th century Scotland came directly from that source, from the sugar, tobacco and cotton industries, which in turn built, shaped cities, towns and communities across Scotland. As we acknowledge there are many legacies, we are confronted with street names, with historic statues, monuments, museum artefacts, which, once celebrated in the past, have become symbols of injustice and pain for many, many people. Our places and museums can bring us face to face with parts of our history that are shameful by today's standards. And as Jeremy Balfour said, changing attitudes is a very important way to do that now. And during Black History Month last year, which is in October, I went on a historical walk through Glasgow City Centre, organised by CRER and guided by Dr Stephen Mullen, who many of you will know. I would recommend it if you get the opportunity to do it. Many people do not understand the reasons behind Jamaica Street, Virginia Street and others named as such. But I did that day from that experience, and as set out in our programme for government earlier this month, we recognised that we must find a better way to present a more accurate portrayal of Scotland's colonial and slavery history and re-examine the way we interpret Scotland's past through our public heritage. People who came to Scotland through the slave trade and the British Empire and their descendants have made an enormous contribution to our country, yet many of these achievements are not celebrated and their stories are not told in the many, many museums and heritage centres across Scotland. That must change. But as Neil Bibby suggested, there is a much more to do, and I do hope that the debate we will have here, the debate that we had in June and the debate which we will have next week will look at some of those wider actions that are necessary to take, especially recommendations from the expert reference group on COVID and ethnicity. To that end, the Scottish Government is proud to be working with Museums and Galleries Scotland to commission an independent expert review group, which will bring together public and expert voices to make recommendations to ensure people in Scotland are aware of the role our country has played in past injustices, as well as the positive legacies and how both elements continue in our society today. Both anti-racism work and improving minority ethnic representation in society are crucial for delivering our vision of a Scotland where everyone is treated equally. And I hope there's a very different look to this chamber after we return from the election next year. As such, an important first step will be to ensure the involvement of diverse representation from across the race, equality and museum sectors in the Museum Advisory Group. That's a key element to what we need to do. The group's expert opinions will be considered alongside findings from a national consultation to include the many and varied views of the people of Scotland, including whether there should be a national museum. And can I reassure CRER, who have written to me last night, that I'll be responding in full, but reassure them that the work that they have been doing over the past few years will most definitely be included in that approach. This debate provides us with an opportunity to recognise efforts to promote equality and what has already begun within the heritage sector. The V&A have already announced that they are doing a review of the stuff that they have got in their museum and how that's presented. Yep.
Jamie Green.
Can I thank the Minister for comments? So much to be welcomed there. But can I just confirm, is it the position of the government at the moment that they're not considering a physical museum, but they're looking at all options which may include a virtual? Or is it just a case of we're trying to find the right place and building and how to fund it?
Minister.
Yeah, the answer is we're going to commission the group to come up with the ideas on whether there should be a physical building or not, or a combination of all or some. So I think we should be leaving it to the expert group and the people who have been campaigning along with CRER for a long time to see what we really need in Scotland. I'm hoping that's a very diverse and interesting recommendation that comes from that group, because I'm sure it will, given the walkthrough that I did with them in Glasgow last year. They've got lots of interesting options there. Presiding Officer, there's a project funded by Museums and Galleries Scotland called Curating Discomfort. It's a name that speaks for itself, really. It's led by the Huntarian in Glasgow and aims to identify new and inclusive ways to interpret existing collections to better address the many meanings and implications of historical assets and their care. We have much to learn from the examples such as those explained by Claire Adamson and Jamie Green on their visits to Canada and Australia and the approach that they have taken. But equality for all of us is critical both nationally and locally. So it is vital to hold these conversations in all of the spheres that allow us to do that. Glasgow City Council demonstrated this in a recent motion by Councillor Graham Campbell and Councillor Annette Christie, which expresses solidarity with equality campaigners, commits to continuing the work with the Coalition for Racial Equality and Rights, and the Council remains an unwavering voice alongside that of this government, which amplifies Black Lives Matter. It's good to hear of the motion in North Lanarkshire Council and the young people learning about their own heritage. And I want to turn to addressing the educational questions that was asked by both Jamie Green and Claire Adamson in a few minutes. But as a nation, Presiding Officer, we are proud to recognise and protect the intrinsic value of all people and to champion the pillars of dignity, equality and respect for everyone in our modern and inclusive Scotland. And human rights is very much at the heart of that. We are determined to engage in eradicating racism, inequality and injustice and build a better, fairer world, which is why we've allocated £2.6 million last year to fund organisations working to advance race equality. And as Stuart McMillan, Jeremy Balfour, Neil Bibby, Claire Adamson and Stuart Stevenson said, we must not erase or ignore difficult elements of our history. Instead, we should seek to reinterpret, adding new layers of meaning to develop better understanding and how we want to live together, working with others, and that is what this government is committed to do. But I also agree with Professor Sir Geoff Palmer on the points that he made. And Jamie Green and Claire Adamson asked me specifically on education. We funded the Fairer Future panel through Young Scot to look at this, and we're looking at ways to engage them in this. Intercultural Youth Scotland, who are an amazing organisation based here in Edinburgh, has been funded and supported to support minority ethnic young people through this pandemic. And the Deputy First Minister is already committing and is working with partners to look at the curriculum, and hopefully we'll have more to say on that over the weeks. Presiding Officer, the work of the expert reference group and the accompanying national consultation will open up a conversation on this very important subject in all of the areas that everyone has raised here tonight. They will deliver insights which will help us establish how we can better manage, present and interpret these elements of our heritage to ensure that we not only look forward to an equal future, but look backwards in a balanced and unbiased way. And I look forward to taking all of this forward in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate, and I close this meeting of Parliament.